What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit the bigger picture of what sustainability might mean in post-conflict settings. And since it is the bigger picture, it's going to be a little bit more abstract and, in a sense, philosophical. Because to my mind it's very important to see how things interconnect and how dynamics moving in one direction might affect others. So there will not be so much about specific challenges in the Middle East or in a specific post-conflict context in the Middle East, although Syria is very much on our minds right now, but the arguments and the ideas are more actually directed towards the bigger issue of transitions to sustainability and what can enable and what can obstruct such transitions. And the name Post-Conflict Futures is relating to a project, a bigger project that we have been running here at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in collaboration with the IIIEE, the Institute for Industrial and Environmental Economics, and which has been very much concerned with visioning, with scenarios, with trying to see collectively what the bigger picture could be and in the long term, not just looking at the immediate crisis, but looking at consequences and implications in the long term. And we have heard again and again that everything is interconnected, and as you're probably aware, there are a number of crises which are ongoing and escalating, both at a global and regional level, which are triggering additional crises. So we have questions of climate change, which are affecting all our populations on this planet, but in different ways, depending on where we happen to be. We have vast global networks of economic dependencies which are affecting us, and every so often an entire country or an entire region will topple over due to these very rapid but also very complex financial mechanisms which play out on a global level. And some of these mechanisms have then also led to escalating migration, escalating numbers of people who are no longer able to live where they live, or who no longer see a future where they are living and need to find lives for themselves and for their children in other parts of the world. And a reaction to this in Europe has been to erect walls between Europe and the rest of the world, and it's not helping, because the dynamics which have been pushing people to leave their homes will continue, and they will not get better, they will get worse until we actually face the ground causes for these crises. So it's very good to know that everything is interconnected, but the big question is, so what? What do we do with this interconnectedness? How do we conceptualize it, and how do we use it as a point of departure to think one step further and to find strategies also to address root causes and not just to deal with the effects such as mass migration? Now, in a post-conflict situation, and in many situations of crises, whether they are conflict-related or not, there is very often the argument that, yes, well, taking care of the environment is fine, we're all for it, but first we need to get the economy working. Doing something for sustainability is fine, but it's costly, so we need to have a bigger economy so that we can take a slice of that bigger economy and feed it into transitions. We would like to do this, but let us be realistic. We have to work within the existing system, and this will create a better situation, and eventually we will also get down to sustainability issues. Now, this is something we've not just been hearing now with the present ongoing crisis. This is something we've been hearing for at least 50 years or more. And we somehow never seem to get to that moment when we have enough, when we have a cake which is big enough to actually take some of it and put it into this issue of sustainability, of our common survival on this planet, of the survival of all the other species which we interrelate with. And the bottom line always seems to be a question of money, economic interests, and having enough resources to actually also do something for the environment. But what is expensive or what is cheap is not something which is absolute. It is what is defined within a particular economic system, within a particular system of technology, within a particular social system. So within a particular techno-social economic system, certain ways of making our living and forming societies will be extremely easy, and everyone will have an interest to do them, and others will be difficult and will be given to specially motivated activists to deal with, or NGOs who deal with these very good issues but which are not mainstream. And in another system, things would look differently. So the big question is really, what are the rules by which we play the games? What are the systems? What are the systemic factors in how we organize our societies on this planet? Now, this is supposed to be a visual for the notion of transition. So here we have this very complex system of technologies, of knowledge, of societal relationships, which we are presently in and which obviously is not sustainable. We have triggered a number of disasters worldwide, and these disasters are accelerating, and we still don't know what to do with them. And this is then the visual of a more sustainable system. And a more sustainable system is, of course, not a singular system. There are multiple systems which would be more sustainable than what we are living to today. But as an example, so the big question is really, how do we get from here to there? And as you see, there is a gap. There is the whole set of interconnected circumstances, which mean that we still continue doing what we do, although we are very widely aware that this is not a good idea, that it is self-destructive at a global level. And this is where we want to be. And in between, there is a state of transition. And the problem with the state of transition is that it is not solid. We would have one kind of system which is functioning. It's not functioning well, but things are interconnected and everything feeds into everything else, and people carry on doing what they're doing. And this is, again, another system where things are interconnected and hopefully functioning in a better way. But anything we do which is outside the mainstream system becomes difficult. It needs support. It doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't happen spontaneously. And it doesn't necessarily have an intrinsic value in itself. So there are not also people who necessarily can conceive what such transitions might look like, and you don't have institutional structures which drive them, which support them. So my argument will be to look a little bit at what are characteristics of such transitions and what what should we be looking for in going from this stage to that stage? And as societies, you can see that this metaphor actually is providing some of the keys, because one of the factors in this situation is that we need to have a confidence that there is somewhere we are going to. And this is very difficult because we're living dark times, and we may not find it obvious that there might be a future which actually might be a better state than we are in now. So we cling to the familiar, although it is not particularly functional or constructive. So the being able even to visualize, to see, to realize, and to feel confident that we will have this future state is very important. There is a question of collaboration, because we cannot as individuals create societies. We need to be several people on a particular pathway to make this happen. So there is a question of being able to collaborate enough to collectively create intermediary structures, pathways, and then also to collaboratively move towards a situation where we can collaboratively shape other systems. And there is a lot of fear, because we are moving out on territories which are fragile, where we don't have institutional support, and where the future is uncertain. Now, in a post-conflict setting, what we are talking about is making the sword into a plowshare and transforming from a particular state of economic, social, technological relationships and shifting to something else. And going into this very concrete metaphor, we also see the problems in this, because the tools, whether these are tools in terms of technology, in terms of social networks, in terms of drivers and motivations and vested interests, in terms of projecting the future and investing ourselves in a particular trajectory, those that work in a militarized context do not necessarily work well for constructing peace and for constructing sustainable societies. So this is what we have seen in many cases, that leadership which works well for military situations does not necessarily work well for peace. And so there is also the question of leadership, which is in this. We have the question of governance, because military governance is very much a question of not consulting, but just obeying in order to be effective in military terms. And so there is the whole issue of transitioning also to more democratic or more participatory forms of shaping our societies. And in a post-conflict context, we have the issue of broken trust. And once trust is broken, it does not mend. Now, there has been a lot of debate about the notion of post-conflict, saying, well, what we see often is a transition from a massive conflict to a situation where the conflict is still there, but not taking exactly the same forms. But what is in common for the various post-conflict situations is that trust, confidence that things will carry on in a familiar way is gone. And in order to regain that, to regain the idea that, yes, I believe that it's worthwhile doing something not just for tomorrow, not just for the immediate needs of my family or myself, but actually investing in the long term, that I can invest in social relationships with people and say, no, these people will not become my enemies overnight, all of these things are not simple. Now, a particular post-conflict context which I am personally familiar with is Bosnia. And I was in Bosnia at the beginning of the conflict for a number of reasons, and I revisited Bosnia after a very long period and was quite shocked to see how the conflict is still very much alive. Now, this is the bridge of Mostar, which was destroyed during the war, and it has been rebuilt. So, in a sense, it's a symbol for rebuilding peace, rebuilding trust, rebuilding confidence, and the bridge has been rebuilt. But the wounds left from the war, they are still very much alive. And today we have a new generation of young people who have not even experienced the war themselves, but who grow up with a sense of injustice, who grow up with, how should I say, a mythological version of the war, because they haven't experienced it themselves, but they have experienced the war through relatives, through their families, through the landscape, through the economy, which is broken. And in this post-conflict situation, we have the makings of new conflicts. And so one of the takeaways is that we really must learn from experiences from other places, because this is not new. This has happened again and again and again, but now we don't have space to make more mistakes. We really need to do this better. This is from Rwanda, and in a short space of time, almost 1 million people were slaughtered. And here, in some years later, we see a very small dent in the demographics. And that's that. And Rwanda has been brought forward as an example of people actually being able to rebuild trust and all of that. And unfortunately, the reality is that this is what people have to say to get government funding. This is what people have to say to get their NGOs working. We need the success story, but the wounds, they are even more vivid in the Rwandan context than in Bosnia. And we also see that we have this accelerating demographic movement, which means that not just in terms of global sustainability, but in terms of the very local sustainability, there's very little time. There's a huge amount of demographic pressure, and there are no structures which are really leading to other forms of demographics or other forms of economics. We're just moving in the same direction, but with a bigger population and with an exploding population. And what do we say? Well, we say we need money, and we need to have these thriving economies. And one of the problems here is that when we measure our economic activity in terms of nominal values, then it really doesn't matter if you are manufacturing a bomb, or if you are building a dam, or if you are producing fruit preserves, or children's clothes, or whatever. So the dynamics, as long as we are committed at a global level to free markets, free trade, and unregulated trade, then the strongest drivers will be whatever gives us the most in nominal value. So dollars or yen or whatever. I mean, I don't have any preference when it comes to currency. But the key takeaway here is that nominal values suppose that there is a value in a piece of paper. And I can think of a lot of things I might want to do with a piece of paper, but it doesn't feed your children, it doesn't save the planet. So what we really need to look at is how are we organizing our actual physical resources? How are we organizing our knowledge? How are we organizing our know-how? How are we organizing our social relationships? Because these are reality. And I could go back to the first slide with the play money, but we're letting the play money run our world. We're letting the play money run our futures. Now, economics is also relevant in terms of infrastructure choices. Now, this is a port, and here we are constructing physical realities which then structure our economic and social relationships. So infrastructure is very much a key question in how we want to move forward, because here we have a meeting between the physical reality of the infrastructure and the types of dynamics which this enables or obstructs. We have the question of getting cash. And the problem in any post-conflict situation is that there is an immediacy in getting some form of support for whatever government you have. I mean, no matter who wins or who wins in which locality, any government needs to be able to fund its policy, to have some form of support locally. You need to be able to pay the people who are supporting your interests. Because if you don't, if you're not paying your supporters, you won't get anything done and you will no longer be in power. So having this play money becomes immensely important, because this is how you create support for your policies. And here the question is, how do you get foreign currency? You get foreign currency by selling fossil fuels. So in the specific context of the Middle East and in several Middle Eastern conflict, this was a significant lapsus, I think. Several Middle Eastern, not conflicts, but contexts, the issue of fossil fuels becomes very strategic. Now, this is also not just a post-conflict issue, it's also a question of existing in governments and how they stay in power in their various contexts. And so just having to buy support as a government is already a driver towards a fossil fuel economy, which we know is not sustainable. But there are also problems with so-called sustainable plans for transitioning. Now, this is a specific plan. I mean, there are immense numbers of them. And this is an idea of using the potential of solar energy, but using it at a very large scale and across very large geographical distances. And here we have solar energy, and we have a number of other sustainables. I think you see more or less which specific geographical regions are interconnected with which other regions, and which regions are absolutely not on the map for whatever reason. So one is cutting out one specific chunk of the African continent and leaving out the rest. And there are also other geographical areas which are very pointedly being cut out of the picture. So this is corresponding to specific relationships between geographical areas, and it is also very much dependent on specific technologies. And the question is also, who is managing these specific technologies? Who is contributing with the play money which is used to invest, to start out the infrastructure and the massive infrastructure which is needed to manage this kind of project? Another issue in post-conflict settings is the question of getting an economy on its feet again. Now here we are going a little bit into the domain of development economics, and the idea is that you follow a particular trajectory and you move from a less developed state until you reach a more developed state. But the problem is, again, we are not talking about something which is just has a purely nominal meaning. We're talking about actual physical reality and interconnected systems. So the problem is, if we build structures in terms of knowledge, in terms of capacity, in terms of physical structures, in terms of relationships between communities, in terms of international relationships, if we build such relationships which correspond to one step on this ladder, on this trajectory, then we have committed to that. And we will still be in the same difficulty of moving from that particular interconnected set of relationships to some other set of relationships. And all of this is happening at a global level. And what we see here is that those relationships are between certain multinational firms who have specific control of specific technologies, and who also have control of specific agendas for what is supposed to be our sustainable future. So we're not talking about sustainability in general. We're talking about specific technologies which are controlled by specific actors, and those specific actors are also localized in terms of getting support from specific countries or national organizations or even international organizations. So the idea that all this goodness, this wealth at a global level will eventually trickle down to the poorer nations of this planet is also something I've heard since I was born, probably, at least as long as I can remember. And we are still not seeing the poorest nations among the nations of this planet reach this miraculous level of development which we were promised so long ago. So one of the very fundamental problems, if we are looking at how do we get from one state of interconnected systems to another state of interconnected systems, is the question of lock-in. And if specifically in a post-conflict setting where you get all your donor organizations, you get all your donor states, you get all your nice private NGOs and good-hearted people and volunteers, and everyone is saying, okay, now we are finished ruining this particular area of our planet, now we will reconstruct it. The question is, what do you put into that reconstruction? What does it look like? What does it look like physically? Because depending on the specific technologies that we choose, the specific infrastructure that we put in place, the specific individuals who we give a position of controlling that infrastructure or those technologies, we will get different possibilities for the future. And we get a lock-in which is of everyone who will have a vested interest of not taking the next step. Now we have our reconstructed society, and this is how we will continue. So we will not get to the more sustainable future. We will get to another setup than before the conflict for sure, but will not have taken any steps towards sustainability. There is a very big issue of vulnerability. Now, vulnerability is in a post-conflict situation also that people are close to, in different ways, other people who are not very happy with what happened last year or the year before. So what we have is a geographical context where neighbors are not very friendly with other neighbors. And this might look very differently. I mean, it can be at the very, very local level of a street. It can be in terms of cities. It can be in terms of regions. But basically, we have a situation where every neighbor is not very happy with every other neighbor. And this means that there are a lot of people who would be happy to upset all these interconnections that we have, who will say, well, if I get a chance to make a problem, I can just give a nudge. And when we have economies which are built on relationships which go over very big geographical areas, then we get a massive amount of such vulnerabilities. Now, this is something we see not just in the conflict or post-conflict context, but we see it, for example, very much when we are talking about the pipelines, the oil pipelines. And for example, we have this whole issue between Nigeria and Cameroon, and the various points along the way between Nigeria and Cameroon where various local actors have made problems and attacked the pipeline and so on. And this precise, the pipeline scenario is something that we have seen versions of, I think, in Tajikistan and in numerous places in the world. So there is also, but besides the question of what is sustainable in terms of the environment, there is a question of what is sustainable in terms of being sufficiently stable to provide a sufficiently stable economic context to be able to get on with things and to actually do reconstruction and to have functioning societies and really to also prioritize environmental issues. So if the way we reconstruct involves building this kind of vulnerability into what we are doing, then we are setting ourselves up for trouble. And this is not it's a gas line, it's not a pipeline, but just in this specific case where we have Egyptian gas going into Israel and going, I mean, you can see sort of visually, just imagine that just in this tiny example, you are already setting yourself up for a number of pressures and well, I will exchange this for that, and or I will take some prisoners and only release them if, and all sorts of things. So what is my suggestion? My suggestion is to try to create settings where we can actually take things step by step. So avoiding lock-in and creating transitional situations which are slightly more solid and slightly less fragile than this long bridge between the very ideal sustainable society and the totally unsustainable. So really paying attention to intermediary steps. How would intermediary steps look like? And also making sure that none of them are very big. They need to be small enough so as not to create thresholds. You should not need to have a huge leap of faith. You should not need to have a huge amount of collective coordination and investment and support to take these steps. This also means to invest in technologies which allow for flexibility and adapting and repurposing. So technologies which are maybe very optimal in terms of producing the most of this or the most of that, but which are creating these huge dependencies and which need these huge investments, they don't give the flexibility of repurposing and constantly also adapting to new knowledge about what is happening to this planet. I mean, if we at a collective level say, oh well, we will go for this engineering of taking CO2 and freezing it and dumping it into the deep sea, well, this is maybe our best choice now with what we know, but maybe in 2 years' time we will see that that was maybe not such a good idea. And then where do we go? Are we able to take a step back and try some other strategies? So the question of being able to repurpose and redirect and change pathways and change direction depending on how things actually develop is immensely important. Now, it's not just a question of flexibility, it's also a question of having various sites. And sites means that we are creating economies which have to do with local populations. And why is it important to have a number of sites of control? Why is it not better to have one particular, shall we say, United Nations body where you have the biggest experts and they all decide what everyone else should be doing? And whatever seems to be a good idea from that particular office in that particular UN body. If we go with one single solution and we go with that single solution at every point on our planet, again we are locking in our capacity to develop various options, various alternatives. It's immensely important that we have actually different solutions which are being developed in different places, because we need this diversity. We need it as like in an ecological system. We need to be able to draw on these various experiences, and to do that we need to have enough diversity. So having various sites of development of alternatives is important. And this again comes down to coupling the power of governance to our economic and technological ways of functioning. So what I would argue is a way forward is not to see autonomy as being closed to the world, because we do need to have trade, we do need to have, foreign students coming to Lund and students from Lund going out in the world, and we do need to have this exchange, but we need to keep a sufficiently short distance between our capacity to collectively decide or think or reflect or devise strategies and our networks. So being able to carry our networks is important, to be able to deploy them, redeploy them, and to have not to have these nets which go out and which get to be so long and so heavy that no one can any longer pull them in, and no one really knows how far they go or what are the implications or what is happening out there among other species or in other parts of the world because of these very, very long chains of interdependency. We need to be able to actually close and open. Now this is good old-fashioned protectionism, and I'm a strong advocate of good old-fashioned protectionism. Now, the most old-fashioned protectionism is we have protectionism to allow our industry at a national level to develop, and then once it is developed, we will flood the markets of surrounding countries. My view on protectionism is to be able to actually decide to decide what is coming in and to decide what is going out, and this even at the level of communities. So we need to be able to look at what we are doing, what are the implications of what we are doing on our neighbors, and what are the implications of what they are doing. And free markets is doing all the opposite. It is, we have the question of currency, foreign currency, where people who have strong currency have a lot to say at a global level. People who have a weak currency have nothing to say at a global level. And so saying, well, we can then sit in a World Council and decide that what comes out of that is that the poorer nations in the world say, oh, okay, the richer nations can emit more carbon, and the poorer nations who don't have to emit so much, they can sell their rights. And so we get this kind of dynamics. So being able to be discerning, to have actually regulatory powers, to be able to say, for example, in Sweden, well, in Sweden there are regulations against certain chemical substances which are dangerous. Okay, we need to be able to say no, it's not a free market. We can say stop. I know I'm not politically correct, but this is my day. We need to be able to build collaboration. So I'm not saying protectionism and everyone is an island unto themselves, because if we do not invest enough time in collaborating, and particularly with our neighbors, with our physical neighbors, because if we're looking at sustainability in the future, the globalized economies are built on massive transport from one end of the world to another. We are importing in Sweden onions from Australia by plane. So I mean, this is the global economy. So to be able to have functioning and prosperous economies, we need to be able to develop, above all, collaboration with our closest neighbors, and then with the extended neighbors. And the collaborative networks also need to have a physical and a geographical basis. We need to have overlapping systems. And this again ties into the question of having steps which are not too high, and also to be able to take a step back. If we invest in a particular solution, and that solution cannot coexist with another technological solution or another alternative, if you have mutually excluding systems, then we have to make a choice. And then if one fails, it becomes very difficult to take the step to the other. So it's very important to have these coexisting systems which make it easy to transition from one technological choice or one choice of collaboration to another. And finally, we need vision, which brings us to our visioning workshops and the scenario workshops. We need to devise much more powerful ways and methodologies and modes of collectively envisaging the future, because to take those steps, to be able to commit to the future, to coordinate efforts, to actually construct futures which are livable, we need to also see where we are going, or where we might be going, and where we definitely do not want to end up. And thank you.